This episode of the Military Matters Review is brought to you by Stars and Stripes. Go to stripes.com, enter promo code podcast, get 50% off your digital subscription. 50% off your subscription. Stripes.com, enter promo code podcast. Folks, the opinions expressed on the Military Matters Review are solely those of myself, Rod Rodriguez, and Desmond Ferris.
That's me.
They do not reflect or represent those of Stars and Stripes. So don't get us fired, okay?
I need this job.
Oh, Rod Rodriguez is having an issue.
You can buy that here? And the guy was like, yeah, you want one?
Who's right?
Fired everything from here to there, you know.
All right, folks, welcome to the Military Matters Review. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
And I am Desmond Ferris.
So last week, we did the episode on red flag laws, or as they are also known as, extreme risk laws. So for this episode of the Military Matters Review, we're going to go back and talk to the Duke Center for Firearms Law, very own Jake Charles. He joins us on the show, and he already has something very nice to say about our episode. But this is a conversation with him and myself, Desmond Ferris, as well. So enjoy.
I just wanted to say you guys did a great episode on this last week. It was fantastic. The issues you explored and the people you talked with, it was really good.
I really appreciate that. So we'll jump right into it. One of the things I was talking to Desmond about just before we all got together was I knew before we ever recorded 1 second of this episode, I said the minute we talk about red flag laws, this is the one that people are going to email us and text us and tweet. This is the one that gets people excited. And I was not wrong.
Not wrong at all.
This week has been very interesting. We have a brand new Twitter, a baby Twitter, if you will. And that was it was this and Kobe Bryant that got a lot of attention. Little known fact, Kobe Bryant, longtime supporter of military families. So of course we gave a shout out on, unfortunate passing, but being here in Virginia, the March on Richmond, everything just like the stars aligned for this episode when it came out. So I want to talk a little bit about the development of the story. And I really appreciate you, telling us that we did a good job and we strived to. I will tell you, I came into the story with my own biases, my own prejudices, if you will, because I came in here thinking red flag laws were a bad idea. This was going to be a way for, corrupt people to take advantage of a system and disarm the populace. I mean, I'm not going to go too far into the paint on that, but it did feel that way.
Call it what it is. Call it what you really think it is, Rod.
Well, that's the problem. I'm not even sure what I think it is or what I thought it was, but talking to you at the Center for Firearms Law and our guests on the show, I could see where there is some good intent for these laws.
Sure.
How is what's your experience been with the red flag laws? Did you come into before you jumped into this world of Second Amendment? Did you have a preconceived notion of this? Did it change? Has it evolved? How has that happened?
Yeah, so before I came into this world, I hadn't experienced them at all. I had no exposure to them, so I didn't have any preconceived notions about them. Before I started studying it, so I'm currently writing a paper with one of the faculty co-directors here, Joseph Blocher, on the due process implications of red flag laws, and we're looking at kind of the constitutional doctrine around that. And so that has been a deep dive that we've done into these laws. And kind of before I got into that work, I think my view was, if not similar to yours, at least recognizing potential for abuse in these, because they were a different kind of gun law. You heard from a lot of opponents of these laws about these kind of concerns. And so I was interested in seeing, is this a wholly novel phenomenon? Is it connected to existing legal frameworks that we have? Are there, instances of abuse? And if so, are those widespread? Do we have ways to mitigate those potentials for abuse? And the more that, I got into it, the more I saw it. Yeah, absolutely, right. There are ways for abuse in this, but I think, like you said, right, there are ways to abuse any kind of law, and there's certainly no more ways to abuse this kind of law, I don't think, than any kind of restraining order, than civil commitment laws. I think one of your guests talked about swatting, right? All of those things are ways that members of the community or others who are hostile to another person can use the legal system wrongly, right? And so that's not a way that we should be arguing against new laws.
Now, when we say the abuse and stuff, I'm from California originally. That's where I grew up. So like gun issues weren't necessarily there as bad. I mean, if people had a gun, they were the bad guys. It wasn't, at least when I was growing up. But when I got to Virginia in the military, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go get me a nice concealed carry, because I was law enforcement in the military. And I walked into a gun store in Virginia, and I saw a 50 cal sniper rifle sitting up there. And I'm like, you can buy that here? And the guy was like, yeah, you want one? And it shocked me that you could just walk into a store and buy a rifle like that. And it made me like think, who's shooting that? And then I asked the clerk, I was like, where can you shoot that? He's like, oh, there's a very small percentage of places you can shoot it, but you can. And I'm like, why? I've never experienced anything like that until I came to one of these states where firearms purchases were a little bit more lenient.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say I grew up in California also, so my exposure here in North Carolina is a lot different than growing up. I grew up in Southern California, right outside LA, and just guns were not, a feature of the common experience there, for recreational or sporting purposes in the way they are in North Carolina and Virginia and a lot of these states that are over here. It is consistent with going back, throughout American history, where there's been a strong regional influence on gun laws and gun culture, right? So Southern states have had since the founding essentially a different kind of gun regulation regime than Northern states have had.
It's an interesting conversation that you're opening up here, Des, with our ability to purchase the firearms that we want to purchase, and the states, and each state seems to have a different personality in terms of how they view the different types of weapons that you can purchase. I grew up in Arizona, and Arizona is an open carry state. So I never had an issue with guns. I grew up with guns. They were everywhere. I mean, you could go to the mall. Actually, you could go to the swap meet. So like in Mexican culture, going to the swap meet was a big deal every weekend. It still is in Tucson. There you would see people walking around with like these giant, dirty, hairy style guns just on their hips. No one batted an eye. No one cared. So I grew up with this around me, and it kind of like, this is great because this ties into an email that we received from, let's see here at the very bottom here, Don and Patty Woolley, who are both NRA members, and they had an issue with Mr. Marvin saying that the NRA is spreading myths. And this is a very lengthy email, which I'm not going to be able to get to all of the points here, but the main core to this email stood as the fundamental argument against red flag laws is that it turns our justice system upside down. That is, we are a country of laws and people are innocent until proven guilty. And they underlined until proven guilty. We do not accept guilty based on supposition and rumors with the burden to prove you are innocent. These laws turn due process upside down. We accept the low standard of reasonable beliefs. Really? The Second Amendment says that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Therefore, red flag laws are on their face unconstitutional and again throw due process out the window. Mr. Charles, I want to know from the Center for Firearms Law, let's take this point by point. Do red flag laws indeed turn our justice system upside down?
Yeah, so I would say I'll take a couple of issues with the premises there. one is this presumption of innocence, right? This is a criminal law context where we have a presumption of innocence, where you're presumed innocent until you're proven guilty. That is foreign to civil law. So civil lawsuits, right, don't have determinations of guilt or innocence. They have liability or non-liability. And red flag laws are a civil procedure. And in that sense, they don't turn our justice system upside down because, one, they're not in the criminal justice system. And two, in the civil justice system, we have these procedures all the time. We have civil restraining orders for domestic violence, for harassment, for stalking. We have child removal orders when a child is in danger of being abused by their parents. Civil procedure. We have deportation proceedings that are civil procedures. And none of these are a determination of guilt. They're not a punishment mechanism in the same way that the criminal laws. They are a prevention mechanism, and they're based on risk, not on guilt. So I take issue with kind of that framing of it, but I understand the intuitive appeal, right? And so I guess the intuitive appeal is I shouldn't have to go to court and prove that I'm not a danger, and that's where I would take issue with the second premise there, which is that the burden is ever on the person whose guns might be temporarily removed. It's never, in none of the systems, in none of the red flag laws in existence, is the burden on the person who is a danger to prove themselves that they are not a danger. The burden of proof at both stages, at the emergency stage, is on the state or the petitioner. And the same at the final stage, it's also on the state or the petitioner. The only time that the respondent ever has a burden of proof is if they do have an order entered against them and they want to terminate it early. Then they'd have the burden. But that's because there's already been a showing made and a judgment found that the law applies to them. And then they would have the burden later to try to end it early. That's the only time the burden is on them.
So my biggest take from this is, a lot of it seems pretty subjective based upon who's making those calls, what state you're in that's making those calls, and it could be maybe they're just having a bad day, or maybe they're having a good day. How much is that actually playing the effect of these judges or personnel that are making these decisions, or against the personnel who either had their weapons taken away, or even further in these other cases you were talking about?
Yeah, and that's kind of, it's broader than red flag laws. Like you mentioned, there's always a concern about how much discretion judges are having and how they're exercising that discretion. We have a lot of discussion about discretionary sentencing regimes and how that influences communities of color more than say white communities. And so sentencing disparities are real there. And, you can imagine that judges applying the law in other areas, like in red flag laws, might bring biases or might bring, subjective determinations to this analysis as well. One thing that does guide the discretion and constrain it is that most state laws have a list. It's not a checklist, but it's a list of factors to consider when they're considering whether or not the petitioner has met the burden of proof. And so they have things like past acts of violence or past extreme risk orders entered against you, past misuse of firearms, other kinds, other mental illness where there's threatening behavior. So there are factors that courts are told to consider in these laws, and they must consider. So most of the laws say that you have to have a written order that states your findings. And so any of those findings can be challenged on appeal, right? And so that's kind of a check on kind of an arbitrary issuance of the orders.
I hear what you're saying. And the logical part of my mind says that your argument, your explanation, really, I shouldn't say argument, your explanation makes sense. But I come back to something that I was discussing with our California attorney, who was also on the show, that if I get a red flag case put on me, or somebody calls, my ex-wife says, oh, Rod Rodriguez is having an issue and yada, yada, my weapons are taken from me. The human factor in here is the judge.
Right.
The judge does not want his name plastered all across the news as the judge who let this murderer get his guns back. So,
yeah.
To the point that our California attorney was making, they may be required for me to go see a psychologist or a counselor, which means I have to pay for that. I might not be in a situation to be able to pay for that, but and kind of going back to the email, it kind of put the onus on me, even though I didn't do anything wrong. I am a law-abiding citizen. I was wrongfully accused of being unstable, and now I have to go spend my own personal resources, my money, and to prove that I'm okay, even though I'm not really part of a criminal investigation. Like you said, there shouldn't be a burden of proof. That's where my heartburn begins.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that's exactly right. Right. The fear is, even if we have a formal burden on the petitioner, right, really you would think, or this argument would say, really what's going to happen is that if somebody comes in and says, they're acting crazy, they're making these threats, really, in reality, you can't just sit back and say no, right? You're going to have to produce some kind of expert or some kind of report that says that you're fine to responsibly handle firearms. I absolutely see that there can certainly be that concern. Well, I guess what I would say in response is that hasn't been happening. We don't see widespread abuse. Excuse me. Domestic violence restraining orders, which allow for a lot broader restrictions on someone's freedom. So, can't contact your children, can't live in your own house, can't own firearms or possess firearms, right? So these kind of orders that are in existence in all 50 states and that have been around since the 80s, there's just not, to my knowledge, any kind of support for widespread abuse of this process. And so a narrower process where you have to show these certain things, and firearms are the only right being affected, not, visitation or child custody or right to enter your own residence, has a narrower avenue for abuse than those other laws that we haven't seen abuse in the 40 years since they've been on the books.
Now, to play devil's advocate on the other side, growing up in Southeast San Diego, where we had the school shooting, Santana, and these other school shootings back in the 90s, when that after Columbine had happened, when you see laws like this, or hey, if they would have said that kid's unstable or the people reported it, and then they went in that house and took his parents' firearms, I see that as, well, maybe we could have prevented children from dying, or this widespread shoot 'em up culture that we've been going through for the last 5 to 10 years is crazy. So some of these laws, in a sense, I see how they can be an issue, but there is a potential, or there is a lot of good that's coming from them if implemented correctly. But that goes far beyond, in my opinion, the courts. It goes to the police officers who are enforcing it. It goes to the teachers. It goes to the bosses. It goes to the managers of establishments to really look at their people and get to know their people, so that if there is an issue and they do make a report like this, it's well founded.
Yeah, I think that makes a good point, that when we're looking at the potential for abuse, we have to weigh it against the potential for harm that can happen, right? So you can have two kind of erroneous rulings on an order, right? One, you can have an erroneous entry of an order where it wasn't justified. So the person, say, wasn't actually a threat, but the court ordered it maybe because they're afraid of getting plastered over the news. Right? On the other side, you can have an erroneous denial of an order where someone is a serious threat. And so if we think about the societal consequences of an erroneous denial versus an erroneous grant, an erroneous grant, right, it may be in effect for 14 days for a temporary one, a permanent one, and up to 1 year one, there's an appeal right. So you have an appeal right. You can go appeal it to an appellate court that's going to look at the record cold, is not going to be as concerned with making headlines, and there's multiple levels of appeal. Right. Whereas if an erroneous denial, if a court denies it and someone is an imminent threat, there might be this shooting, right? There might be this suicide that could have been prevented without it. And kind of to that, I'll say that researchers at the University of California, Davis, are undertaking a study of California's law, and they found 21 instances in which California's version of HRBO's laws were used to potentially prevent mass violence. So 21 instances in which a person threatened workplace violence or school shooting, where the orders were issued and there was not that violence afterwards.
So I guess, if we were to kind of take a summary of this, do extreme risk laws or red flag laws, do these laws, A, stop mass shootings, and B, stop suicides? Are they doing it?
Yeah. So A, I would say the evidence is out still. There is some of that anecdotal evidence from the researchers in California, but even they say that they're not finding a cause, or they're not claiming a causal connection yet. These are just examples. They found they're doing a bigger study. But B, on suicide, I'll say that so far the evidence has pretty consistently shown that states that have implemented and used these red flag laws are showing reductions in suicides.
I want to touch on another tweet that we got, and it's slightly off topic, but I do want to address it because we did get this tweet, and I think it's an interesting position. Banning semi-automatic firearms is the only way to meaningfully reduce firearm-related homicides in this country. This kind of goes back to Desmond's observation when he's in Virginia. There's a Barrett 50 cal on the wall. Do you want to buy it? Sure. Banning semi-automatic firearms. When we look at the types of firearms and we're going to say, we're going to ban this, we're not going to allow that. Where does that fit into the world of firearms law?
Yeah, so there is a very spirited debate about assault weapons bans, as I'm sure you know. So I think 7 states currently have one. Every one of those that has been challenged in court, all of the federal courts of appeals have upheld the assault weapons bans. Some have said these semi-automatic firearms with certain characteristics are not protected under the Second Amendment, are not covered as Second Amendment arms at all. Some have said even if they're covered under the Second Amendment, the state has a compelling enough reason to ban their possession or restrict it in certain ways. On the other side, lots of states and lots of advocates think that one, these laws aren't going to do anything, and two, that it's hard to square bans on a certain type of weapon with what the Supreme Court has said is protected under the Second Amendment.
Now, I am a gun owner myself, and being prior military, police, have fired everything from here to there, I just honestly, in my opinion, I don't find any reason to have extreme amounts of ammunition come out the end of a weapon while we're here in the United States. It's one of those things I'm like, who are you fighting that you need 30 rounds to come out of your weapon that fast in the United States when we have a law enforcement community, we have a system that's here to protect and serve, but I understand our right. It's just why are these things? Why are they that much important that people want to protect?
But I think this is coming down to the fundamental argument. It comes back down to why we're even doing this podcast episode. It's the reason that we need a firearms law center, because there are there are a lot of different ways to see this. There are different perspectives on that. I can see that the idea behind the Second Amendment was to arm the populace and to prevent the government from being tyrannical and preventing the police officers that we depend on right now to enforce the laws that we enjoy from enforcing laws that would be unconstitutional. As a service member myself, the first thing I did was we raise our hand and, swear to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. So the minute we have a government, whether it's a president or a Congress, that says, take away the firearms from the civilian populace, disarm the populace, whether it's semi-automatic, automatic, doesn't matter, disarm the populace. Citizens who are pro 2A want the ability to defend themselves. So if that means I have to defend myself with a Barrett 50 cal, then that's what I'll use to defend myself, because the police officers, the military will be equally, if not more armed than I am. So I need to be able to put up a fight. I get it. But at the same time, I get both sides of this. I know what you're saying, Des. I get it. What's your perspective on this, Mr. Charles?
So I think this is illustrating how there's this debate about what the purpose of the Second Amendment is, right? Is it just a self-defense right? In which case, maybe we say certain types of weapons aren't likely to be used very often in self-defense. So there's some studies that, most self-defense uses of guns, the proponents fire 2 to 3 rounds, right? And so a ban on, 30 round magazines is not going to infringe on that self-defense right. But there's this other argument that you're talking about, Rod, where the view is that the Second Amendment is an anti-tyranny provision, in which case limiting the number of rounds that you can have is not going to help advance that. And in fact, it's going to be the opposite. It's going to allow the government to limit the resources that can be used against it if it becomes tyrannical. And then there's kind of another view, which is just like an autonomy view of the Second Amendment, which is kind of what you were getting at, Desmond, which is, I want it and it's my right and I can have it. And so just protect this autonomy right where you get to choose whatever you want to have. I'll say that the anti-tyranny view and the autonomy view are a little inconsistent with what the Supreme Court has said. They are consistent with kind of the founding generation views of this, but they're kind of inconsistent now. The Supreme Court has said, Justice Scalia, the conservative stalwart, said, M16s and the like can be banned, and this has been taken to mean that automatic weapons are, completely fine to be banned for civilian use. And since 1934, the federal government has heavily regulated machine guns, and there hasn't been really any kind of contemporary challenges to that. And so there's this kind of recognition that weapons that are suitable for military use that the government does have and could use tyrannically against the people, citizens just aren't allowed to have those. Civilians aren't allowed to have those for civilian use or for private purposes. And that's kind of, I would say, a settled matter of constitutional doctrine. There's a debate about which weapons are most useful for self-defense and what kind of self-defense purposes are consistent with the right. But kind of this argument that we can have whatever weapons we want just because there's a Second Amendment doesn't kind of square with where the doctrine's at right now.
Mr. Jake Charles, who's right? I'm just kidding. I'm not going to put you on the spot like that. No.
that was a hard one.
No, I mean, I do. I think that what we're looking for in this discussion is dialogue, and I don't think we're getting enough of that. I think it sounds to me like a lot of people are so passionate. It's like anything else, whether we're talking about, hot button items like immigration, abortion. People are really bringing passion and conviction to these arguments. So I don't envy your position being at the Center for Firearms Law. It seems like that is the kind of place with crosshairs on it for all political sides. Everyone's going to argue with you. You're just not going to be right to everybody. How do you reconcile having to work in a science, but also this science has a very strong cross-section with the culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually a great place to be where we do have this distance from both sides, right? We're not advocating for policy positions. We're not saying, all states should enact an assault weapons ban or all states should do, X, Y, or Z policy proposals. And we're also, not saying that, on the other side that the Second Amendment protects machine guns or things like that. Kind of what our goal is to do is to bring some kind of structure to the debate in terms of what constitutional law is doing. This is an area where popular constitutionalism, where the Second Amendment gets invoked a lot, but kind of without regards to the parameters the Supreme Court has set on it and what other courts have said about it. And frankly, what our history shows, there is a very long history of regulation of firearms in the United States. So to to kind of say that states that have strict firearm regulations today are, somehow infringed on the right just by that very fact, it ignores the history that we have of highly regulated firearms, and especially highly regulated firearms in cities more so than rural areas. Kind of going back to what I said, there's a big regional variation, but there's also variation within states and within geographic regions. So what we're trying to do is engage in these kind of discussions in a way towards getting out there accurate and balanced information about kind of what the Constitution says and what courts are saying it says, so that when it gets invoked in arguments, it's not just as, well, I have a Second Amendment right, therefore every gun law is unconstitutional.
So how, and I understand what you guys are trying to do to get the message out there. How do you prevent this from being that wave? And what I mean by wave is where every four years it becomes a big talking topic and then it starts to die down, or every 2 years it becomes a big talking topic and then it starts to die down, or there's an incident, becomes a big talking topic and then it dies down. Like, how are you guys working at it there to make this where it's a constant conversation to ensure that first our rights are upheld and second we are protecting our people?
Yeah, so what we're kind of trying to do is convene scholars to have these kind of conversations with, both within a scholarly community, so that there is more scholarly discourse and writing and research going on about these topics, and also that there's public-facing things that we're hosting and public conversations that we're having to kind of sort of do our part to educate and to learn from communities that are affected by gun violence, and also, communities that strongly believe in gun rights, and, kind of have a strong culture of exercising Second Amendment rights and using firearms for shooting and hunting and self-defense purposes. And so having these conversations with a whole bunch, with a wide range of spectrum throughout the year, regardless of what's happening in the news, is kind of one of the ways we're trying to keep this conversation going.
Sir, I want to thank you again for taking time out of your schedule once more to talk with us here on the Military Matters Podcast Review. Means a lot to us to be able to talk with someone who is an expert such as yourself in this, especially in a world where everybody has an opinion, but very few of us have an education or the knowledge, the breadth of knowledge that you do. Where can we learn more about your organization and you?
Yeah, so the Center for Firearms Law has a website on the Duke Law website, and we have a blog called Second Thoughts that discusses different issues of the Second Amendment and firearms law.
Terrific.
And I'm on Twitter as well at Jacob Charles NC.
You seemed very hesitant to throw that Twitter handle out there.
No, I like it. And the center has a Twitter at Duke Firearms Law as well.
Awesome. All right, sir. Thanks again. We will be talking with you again. I'm almost positive that this conversation is not over.
Happy to. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
All right. So it's just you and me, Mr. Desmond. Let's do our post-show wrap-up. So that was Jake Charles from the Duke Center for Firearms Law. I'll tell you, this is like we said in the interview, a very passionate discussion from all sides. It doesn't matter where you're coming from, whether you're pro, anti. People are bringing in everything. I mean, they're bringing religion. They'll bring in your Constitution. Doesn't matter. This is just a hot button item.
I mean, it's hard. It's hard because I'm sitting there listening while in the conversation, and he's talking about stuff, and I'm like, wow, I feel this way now. And then it's like, oh wait, no, I'm feeling. Well, let me ask this question, and it's like back and forth while in one conversation. So I'm not gonna say I 100% have made up my mind, but I do know I'm a gun owner, and I'll continue to do that or be that way. And I believe I'm going to keep a eye out and the ear to the news to his organization to see what they're going to keep doing for.
I think at the end of the day, it always comes back down to the people that we elect, the people that we put in office. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, It really depends on who you're putting into those positions of authority that you're going to have to trust to make those right decisions. Our I keeps calling him our California attorney, and he's gonna be like, dude, I have a name. But we'll put him in the show notes as well, so you can go check out his stuff. But, it goes back down to what he was saying about 5150s, about the different types of laws that have already been in place that you can lose your firearms rights permanently from. But here's the thing. We trust our police officers. We trust our judges. We trust our elected officials to do the right thing. Thank you, David Salvin. That's his name, David Salvin, a lawyer for you. But that's what it really comes down to, is we elect these people to do the right thing, and we trust the system that we live in. I trust the crossing lights, the intersection lights. I trust our highways. I trust our police officers. When I get pulled over, I trust that this police officer is going to make the right decision. He's going to abide lawfully. We've seen it not happen. We've seen judges make crappy calls. We've seen police officers make crappy calls. But more importantly, I've seen people make crappy calls. I have a friend of mine who's going through a really ugly divorce. I'm talking ugly. The first thing the spouse did was claim sexual assault. And my friend's attorney said, oh, we knew that was coming. Not because it happened, but because that is literally the opening salvo to 99.9% of all ugly divorces, is a claim of sexual assault or a claim of molestation against the child that might be involved in custody. So people suck sometimes. They just do. We just have to trust the system that it's going to do the right thing. And if it doesn't, and we end up at a tyrannical government, then we need a Desmond Ferris with his gun to lead us out of the wastelands, like Escape from New York.
It's easy for people, for some of us in different positions, to say we should just trust, when there's a large part of our population out there that can't trust. But at the end of the day, it's people like you, Rod, and myself having conversations like this that are bringing these issues to light, and just maybe that little bit of conversation we had could possibly make a change. And that's why I'm happy we do this. And, sometimes we talk about how we may not agree about things, but this is one thing we agree about. Conversations need to happen.
Dialogue, 100% dialogue. And good, and let me clarify that. Good dialogue. And let me take another step further. What is good dialogue? When you make some sense, not just saying, these people are bad because I don't like what they said. Okay, well, that's not dialogue. That's just you're angry and you have an opinion. I like dialogue where we can really have some type of discourse. You bring your facts, I bring my facts, and we'll lay it on the line. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who you're. This podcast was really meant to illuminate, but not advocate. I'm not advocating for red flag laws. I'm not saying we need them. I'm not saying we don't need them. I'm not advocating Second Amendment. I'm not saying you have the right to bear arms, and I'm not saying you don't have the right to bear arms. I think what we did was we shined a spotlight on a topic that people are very passionate about, and they're marching on Richmond. They're everywhere. The conversation is in the zeitgeist of America right now. Make your own decision. I mean, that's it. Make whatever decision you have with the facts that have been presented to you. That's it. Any parting shots, Mr. Desmond?
I just want to give a shout out since they did tweet us. Shout out to Lucky Duck. We did read your tweet. We did appreciate your reply, along with all of our other personnel out there. Tweeting us, emailing us. We really appreciate it. Keep shooting us tweets. Keep emailing us, and hopefully we keep this conversation going.
100%. Hey, Des, let me ask you a question.
Uh-oh.
How's your PT? How's your physical training right now? How do you feel about your push-ups?
Oh, I'm solid. Solid.
I would use many words to describe your physical state. Solid would not be one of them. But, bam, bam, shots.
I am down 50 pounds, sir. Okay.
Shots fired on the MMR. But the next episode, next Thursday, folks, we are talking about the changing physical fitness standards, the training itself across the DoD. Across the DoD. And what started this? What prompted this? I'm an Army Reserve officer, and I will be taking the Army's combat fitness test later this year. So a lot of my soldiers were very curious, very skeptical about this. So I wanted to learn more about the ACFT, but I learned a lot more than just what the ACFT is. We went to all the branches. Des, we got all 4 branches on the show.
Oh, man.
You know how hard
we got the best 2? I know we do got the best 2, though. At least best 1.
Ooh, you're definitely right. The Army is on the show. You know who I do kind of feel bad for? I did not get there. I didn't get your story.
I know where you're going.
I did not talk to the Coast Guard. I want to apologize to our Lacostees out there. I did not talk to them, but I have a friend whose son is at the Coast Guard Academy, and he says that they PT the heck out of them. So maybe
and they swim, and they got to swim too.
They got to do all sorts of stuff.
Ooh.
So some Coast Guard stories are on the way. Those guys are kicking butt, taking down like narco subs and stuff. So that's a story that will be coming down the pipeline. So next Thursday, physical fitness training standards, all the good stuff. So stay tuned. Des, any parting shots for us before we head out?
I don't know. Just think about it and keep on listening.
Folks, we'll see you at the next episode.